And so that's one part of the city we can be very specific. That would be associated with the beach fund, not the general fund, but it's part and parcel of the same upping of our presence.
So that would be, again, you said the beach, Snook Islands.
Old Bridge, under the bridge, under the
Bridge.
bridge, we had problems there, and Bryant.
And Bryant Park, okay.
Correct.
The second proposal would be to add those 2 deputies plus a deputy on each of the 2 night squads. That would help quite a bit too with the night deputies. That would give us another 1 on each squad, and they're already running pretty much call to call. And then the third one would be to add a deputy each of the 4 squads, and then additionally the 2 beach deputies. And that would get us close. That would be close to what we had at the merge when you take into consideration the lieutenants and sergeants that we were able to move out without any loss of service. I'd be good there, and then there's some other ideas.
How many were moved out in 2000?
We went from 91 to, what was it?
80.
So 11, but about half of that was lieutenants and a couple sergeants.
Yeah, in all
Myself included.
in all fairness, the negotiations on the city's behalf was to try to trim it down to really the badges on the street. It wasn't about supervisory staff, and I think the city probably did a good negotiation with that. It seemed to match the call loads, but we can't keep things static in the city where the statistics are showing things are changing. So we can't continue to go forward, we believe, with the same configuration that was set 6 years ago.
I'm concerned the lifeguards in certain positions too, they're acting like police officers or bouncers
Yeah,
of
they
the,
can't.
on the beach,
That's
and they're getting hurt.
We met with them, and I advised them to be good witnesses, not to take action that law enforcement would take. Our response time, I checked, it's about 4 to 5 minutes to get to the beach on average, which isn't bad until you're a lifeguard standing between 2 people ready to fight, and it seems like an eternity.
It's unacceptable behaviors for people to witness at a park and the beach, so they need to be there present on the sand at those high peak times.
And increased drug activity too in some of the park spaces.
There's prostitution, there's drug activities, there's a general sense of lawlessness in some of these areas, and we need to up our game.
Vice Mayor.
Yeah, I don't want to cut too much into the presentation, but on the issue of the beach, 2 things. Will there, you guys have your, what do you call them, buggy?
We have the four-wheel
Four-wheel.
ATVs, and we have a.
Will you be using those as their primary mode
We
of
can,
transportation up there?
We could
So
do
you could
that.
actually be on the beach.
With that extra deputy, we could do that, at least some of the time. Right now, it would be too difficult, because again, they'd be coming back over to
Right.
take
We-
calls.
We believe if we curb the drinks
Right.
before they get into the parking lot,
Sure.
some of that rowdy behavior will be.
And the other comment I want to make is, when we go to the football games, they splash if you have trouble, rowdy, fan or whatever, text whatever number and somebody will come. Do we have that capability, so instead of dialing 911, would we be able to implement a policy where at the beach level or the parks, they could text a number if there's a problem?
I like it. We do have the new Connect and Protect app. They can actually go right to the district commanders. Initially, I was getting 1 or 2 a week, now I'm getting like 5 or 6 a day. We're already doing that. It shouldn't be hard maybe to do that, or to add a special text.
And then we can post signs all over the place.
That would help.
You need PBSO at the parks,
Yeah.
text, and then it's not so much a 911.
Technology is a good thing.
Yeah.
The only other, and again, we mentioned beach fund, which really isn't up for discussion tonight. The more generalist deputies, which would be assigned at key times of the day to add more boots on the ground, which is certain hours. And then the other component, which will come to you in the discussion about the electric and the water funds, is having someone assigned to the annex building because of the utility billing function. We've received concerns over the years from the internal auditor, different ones about safety and security there. And that person could be there, also the cultural plaza and the library. We have a lot of problems in the bathrooms and things over there as well, and show a presence. And that's funded not out of the general fund, but at these other functions. And then there's some homeland security issues we've talked about individually, I don't know in great detail, that we need to up our game on as well. And we are in those discussions and negotiations with the sheriff's office. The mayor's going to be joining us in some of these as they proceed along. and then we'll be back more detailed numbers. Generally, as a rule of thumb, and I don't want to be held to this, but this is an estimate, every officer you add is approximately about $115,000 all-in cost. Okay, that's kind of just the general estimate number. All right. Thanks, Captain.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The next discussion, policy discussion, in getting at the issue of rental license compliance and the problems we're having in that part of the city. And it's pretty much uniform across the city, this issue. It's not unique to just one part geographically. We believe we're probably at 40 or 50% compliance rate. So I asked staff to work with the GIS gurus and the databases that we have, and they were able to estimate a number that we think potentially is out there by taking non-homesteaded properties and properties that were multi-unit and properties who have rental leases at the utility department, but they're not the owner of the property. There's just kind of some blatant data that's sitting out there. And they compiled that, and we came up with over 1,900 properties that we suspect may be having rentals going on without license. And it covers all kinds of properties, all kinds of owners. So in order to do that and get at that issue, staff had looked at what Delray does, because they deal with a lot of the rental problems that we grapple with as well. And based on the way they do business, put together a proposal, which is in the blue documents or the HD system general ledger. And I'm not going to take you to it, but just suffice it to say, when we put the numbers together to size it to our city, it was $866,000 at a whole new division to do rental license compliance. Well, obviously, that's a great idea, but it's just not reasonable. So we had to come up with another set of proposals. And I'll let William, if he's here, if he wants to come up and talk in more detail, you might have some questions with him. He can go over that option as well as the option that we believe is a better alternative and is reflected in the budget brief document. William Waters.
For the record, William Waters, Community Sustainability Director. In describing option one, we've been working collaboratively with the City Attorney's Office on just what would need to be put in place to replicate or get at a similar program as Delray Beach. And in summary, what it does involve is a systematic requirement for all residential and commercial rental licenses to include information that we would keep track of, such as the term of the lease, the tenants involved, and some other sundry information that we don't require now when we issue business licenses for other commercial rentals or residential rentals. In conjunction with that, to confirm that the dictates of those leases are being met, we would have to do routine inspections. For residential properties, it would have to be at a minimum every other month, because we have a 60-day requirement for the residential rental licenses with single-family residential. It could be less frequent with the commercial ones. It would put a gigantic burden on staff to routinely do 6 inspections every year for every residential property, confirm that the tenants that were listed under the lease are the same tenants that are there now, to make sure we weren't having properties that were being leased at terms less than what's under our code. In addition, most of those inspections we could not generate or charge the owner for. It would be a burdensome cost that would be very difficult to defend with the property owner. So it's much of a cost incurrence that doesn't really generate a whole lot of revenue. So option two, another way, and city managers sort of introduced it, is how can we utilize the staff that we have now. We're proposing to add a neighborhood liaison officer to help coordinate more aggressive, comprehensive inspections under the licensure program that we have now. This will be tackling the 2,000 plus properties that the city manager mentioned that we suspect are lacking a license. There are also properties that have a license, but what they are licensed to do may not be what they're doing, and there are many properties that require more than one license, and we haven't been able to figure out exactly from HD, our software management program, how many of those properties are lacking the multiple licenses? We would get at that as well through a mapping process. So we would focus on the enforcement of the residential and commercial licensure by district, by block. We would also focus on the worst blocks first, and then we also heard you're directed to look at worst first as well. And so as we were assessing each block in a systematic way, we would tackle the code compliance issues that are the worst of that particular block, and they would vary by the district that you would be in. Citizen-generated complaints may be affected. Right now, citizen-generated complaints are the priority in code compliance, and we respond very much like PBSO does to whatever kind of complaint that might be. It probably takes up a third to a half of staff's time responding to those complaints, and each staff officer right now is managing between 200 and 300 active code cases. They do come and go. Each officer generates cases every month. Many of them are quite involved, and we still have over 1,000 cases that are in a point where Mr. Maxwell has spoken quite often. It's time to do something like foreclosure, but we don't have the money to foreclose those properties.
200 to 300 cases per
Officer, their manager.
per
At any
week,
one time,
year,
all the
all
time. They may close 20 cases a month, they may generate 35 new ones, but at any one time, they're between 200 and 300 cases each. And they are required to maintain a log of all those cases to keep them up to date, so we know is something coming out of compliance, is something else happened there. So it's quite involved. We do feel that we can make a difference in this approach. We will need the buy-in of both the citizenry and the commission, that the citizen-generated complaints might have delayed action on them, while we make a focus on the residential rental inspections and the enforcement that is there. This redirective of current resources has an additional cost, which I believe is in the budget, of about $110,000 the first year, and thereafter $82,000 annually for the officer. We're having to buy another car. It would be adding one new staff person to the current population of code compliance staff. Vice Mayor.
Thank you. You mentioned that this proposal would, in all probability, need some buy-in from both the public and others. I guess what I'm getting at is, if this option is considered by the commission and we move forward, is it possible to take these complaints as they come in and enter them into the system that we currently have, so folks know that we have the complaint on file and we're going after it? In other words, the way that the current system works, as I understand it, is we should be able to go in and find out if there's an active code case on a piece of property. Can't we take that to another level so folks could say, because of this potential option being put into play, and somebody calls from somewhere in the city about XYZ, and it gets logged into the system, that address, something pending, inspector pending or something like that, so people know that it's been identified and the city's gonna be working towards that, as opposed to not putting anything out there and having folks wonder why they're calling and calling and calling and they're not getting a response. And again, it goes back to the communication about what our priority is and what we're trying to do, and let people know that we're not just ignoring their call.
I like that too. I think that a lot of our communication problems, we just had a conversation about this earlier, is that people want you to know. People want to know that you know.
Exactly.
And in addition, if you say, that maybe some of those call-ins might not be answered as quickly as in the past because of the refocus, obviously if the same address or same property gets dinged over and over again by different people, multiple complaints on the same thing, that should automatically escalate the property up to we need to put that into our list if you get multiple calls on the same property, I would think, right? Or not?
Makes sense.
Commissioner Meyer?
Thank you. I can see the logic of that idea. If we are going to liken the way that your department operates, receiving citizen complaints, the way that, PBSO would operate, if a resident called a complaint, a crime complaint on someone through PBSO, would it seem fair to identify the person that has been called upon before the department has actually determined whether or not that person has committed a crime? So I'm making a correlation to your department. I can understand why someone who called in would want to see that something is happening with their call, that action is happening, but before your department has actually determined that there's a problem, does it seem fair to put that resident sort of on public notice that they're being looked at or someone has complained about them? Doesn't it seem more legitimate maybe to actually determine whether something's wrong before you put someone's personal information out there?
If I could, I think the dilemma we're facing here is there's a group of calls that come in a third to half on a regular basis about properties in general. And the way we're looking at this program, we've given it a 3-month window to focus on cleanup. Tracking and determining cases, that's almost like working the case. You know, you're gonna spend an inordinate amount of time, and that's gonna take away from our ability to actually go and do the inspections of the potential illegal. So at some point, I guess maybe from staff's perspective, we're asking, is it okay to maybe put a different kind of message out there that unless this raises to the level of a serious code case, a life safety issue, we're doing this right now, and we may not get to that for a while. Thank you so much, but,
Right.
and it's gonna make some people angry, let's be honest. And they don't really appreciate the levels of staffing and the resources we have now, and they expect when they call, they wanna see a code officer out there. The next call's gonna be to y'all.
Right, I know.
And
it
we
is.
want y'all, as we go through this discussion on how we do this process, to really appreciate, we'll do the best we can.
Right.
But we put them on a list, or we investigate, or whatever, they're gonna be angry because they're not gonna respond. There goes the city again, they're not doing their job. That's kind of what our concern is in the conversations we have. So if you've got some ideas on how to address that better.
I would just at least take into consideration, maybe not the notification process of it, because I take your point very well. But at least, again, if there are multiple calls to the same properties, that should at least elevate the necessity for listening to a phone call, you know, or a complaint. Did you have a follow-up?
Sure, just a potential solution might be to email the person that made the complaint and say that this property has been added to the caseload of one of the officers.
And there's your confirmation that it's been
Well,
sent.
we're not always able to do that because remember, we do take anonymous complaints. So when we take those, we don't have a name, we don't have a phone number, and we don't have an email address. And because of you're working with us, the number of anonymous complaints has gone up dramatically.
That might change, however, if in exchange for releasing their anonymity, they would get this this email that would confirm that their complaint is being addressed. Perhaps it's too easy to be anonymous now.
We'll come up
Is
with
that
a
a
couple of
truth?
concepts here to try to give the sense that it's somebody complaining legitimately, that we're gonna take some action at some point, but also some explanation about what we're also doing, why we may have a delay. And they may appreciate that and say, oh, I get it. Hopefully with our new community information officer, and that we can push out this information, everybody will get on board and support it, and give us a little bit of a respite on the complaints.
Mr. Alonso?
William, just for clarification, so in essence, you're bringing on an extra person because you have 7 code officers, you're,
We have 8.
you have 8 code officers. So you're bringing on an extra person, so that'll be 9. And even with the extra person, you're telling us that it still might jeopardize the calls to service with 8 plus 1.
For a 3 to 4 month period.
Well, the more people that comply with their requirements for a license, remember, we have a requirement to do use and occupancy inspection every 3 years. If a tenant changes in a space commercially, we have to do an inspection. If a property changes ownership, we do an inspection. So as we get higher and higher compliance with our business licenses, both resident and commercial, we have a commensurate rise in required use and occupancy inspections. There will be a hit on our being able to tackle all of the general complaints that come in, because we're running behind now. And I think all of you are aware that we just can't get to all of the code complaints that we have now, besides adding on an agent directed to really get at the business license issue and our low compliance rate.
Now, are you up to date on your documentation as far as getting, because I know a couple years ago you went out and started looking at some of the identifying whether it was a single family home, whether it was a business, whether it was and you documented a lot of that. Are you up to date now with actually, being able to be notified if, a renter changes or a landlord changes? Landlords, I understand, if you come in for a business license, it automatically alerts you. But how do we do that with residential? If somebody has a business license, if they're changing?
We have to do, we are working on an interface with our computer systems and GIS to get improved data transfer from the property appraiser's office so that when properties change ownership, we can run a report. Okay, these are all the ones that have the same owner as the business license is in. These are the ones that have changed ownership. That would trigger us contacting them saying, hello, you need to get a business license or you need to have it transferred. We don't have that fully up and running. If you did, thank you very much, approve some funding, a budget amendment earlier this year to purchase the software. And we're still working on creating all the modules and the test runs that actually works between the GIS, Geographic Information Service software, and the HTE, hard to explain software, which is our database.
And when do you think that will be up and running?
Inside jokes.
It's actually running, it's running now. That's part of where the information came that the city manager mentioned, being able to cross-reference what properties were not homesteaded, had multiple units on them, were designated as either multifamily or more than one unit residential, and all the properties that are commercial, comparing that to all the properties that had at least one current business license. And then the difference was 1,900 properties. Keep in mind that with commercial properties, if there's a landlord who's leasing the property out and there is a tenant, there should be at least 2 business licenses. We haven't gotten sophisticated enough to get it down to where we know that both those licenses are there. We're working on that piece.
Does any other city do that?
I'm just gonna speak from my knowledge of West Palm Beach. I have a guest house in the backyard. It's rented. It's had an active business license since 1992. It has never been inspected, and the city's never come looked at it. We are one of the few cities that does a systematic review, use and occupancy inspection that I know of. We have had a tremendous influx of code compliance from property owners and improvements in properties, which you will see in the number of cases that have complied over what they used to be. We've also generated a whole lot of cases out of the fact that, oh, you failed to use an occupancy inspection, you need to do these other things. And the housing stock and building stock in the city is exponentially getting better. Where we started was about as bad as you could get. So even though I know we get a lot of complaints that it's not looking that much better, if you really look from block to block, there are a lot of individual properties that have improved. We may not have gotten to the whole block, but the city is looking a lot better. And you'll also see that in the numbers with the building permit on revenue.
I just get a lot of complaints about when we changed that was back in like 2012.
She's talking about the licensing.
Business licensing.
Be in business to rent, and then the business renting, paying a separate license.
Well, it's very legally hard to defend that we require a residential property owner to rent a property out for money to have a business license and not require a commercial property owner to have something that's similar.
But they're paying an additional license in a commercial business to operate a business.
The tenant would be.
I'm saying that in a commercial, the tenant would be in a commercial application, whereas the residence is paying for it because the renter in a residential situation is not paying for a license.
Right, but if the renter has a home occupation, they have to get a business license.
Okay, I see what you're saying, yeah. But
If you're doing something that makes money with your property, whether you're the owner or the tenant, in the city of Lake Worth, you have to have some form of business license. That makes it easy. We don't discriminate.
I just tried to find that in other cities and I haven't found that
everyone
anywhere.
We're a little, we have broadened it, but there was no other way to get at the structural building issues and inappropriate uses and the number of other things that were identified when I arrived and when most of you came on board that we needed to address without having a very comprehensive, treat everybody the same, nobody's discriminated against, everyone has to have a license, everyone has to have an inspection.
Commissioner Marcel?
And I just wanted to comment, and thank you for that, because, you know, when we did come on board, we had a lot of calls, and I'm still getting calls. We had one this week, you know, where the tenant called and had issues, and we went out and it was fixed. But we had a lot of, especially on Dixie Highway, on the west side, where we had tenants renting from landlords that didn't fix their properties.
Right.
And, you know, some of them we didn't even know if there were illegal things, there were things that weren't permitted, and, you know, just, so we've cleaned a lot of that up through this process.
But that would have been caught if we, that was one of the 1,900 properties we've just identified.
So that's the.
That doesn't have a license.
The 1,900 is the next group. 'Cause we
Right.
have- I think we have 11,000 parcels in the city, maybe we're already at 12. So having 2,000 that are questionable is a very high percentage.
Right, well, what I'm saying is that property that you responded to is not probably, doesn't have a license to be renting out.
Correct.
Correct, that's what I'm saying, so that, finding them.
And I only know it because I got called by the tenant
Right.
that had complained. They had 3 small children and they had rats and
The only
all
way we
kinds of
find out.
issues. Yeah.
Really?
Well, the other piece to keep in mind too is that we have had complaints that we reduced our frequency of inspection, because it's unbelievable how fast some properties can go downhill in that 3-year period from the first inspection to the third one. We are dealing with tenants, you know, it was past the inspection, it's a 1.5 or 2 years later, and the property was not past the inspection. So they do call us, and so having that license in play does give us some teeth to help the tenants out.
Vice Mayor?
Is it time for us to seek help from the community with respect to rentals? Is it time for us to come up with some sort of a system or a program where tenants can actually call code and say, hey, look, the landlord's not fixing X, Y, or Z, and then they can invite you in, and then that's when things really get exciting with the property owner?
Well, tenants have that ability now, and we have had complaints from tenants. Unfortunately, oftentimes, the code compliance process, as you know, is a door courtesy notice, please do something by a certain date. If that doesn't happen, it goes to a notice of violation, do something by a certain date. The tenant is still there. Often by that time, the landlord has found out that the tenant is the person who complained, and there's now friction between the landlord and the tenant. It goes to a special magistrate, that has a time to order. And we've had a lot of people who are tenants, would like to see improvements be able to be directed and required by the city at the onset. But we have to go through the code compliance process, which puts the burden of improvements on the property owner, not the tenant. So tenants often, unfortunately, do have to move. In the worst cases, they are losing their security deposits and possibly a month's rent, which most of them can't afford, but I don't know how to fix that.
Just, I'd like to have a conversation with staff and potentially the community and the commission going forward about some sort of tenant resource, because there are a lot of abuses out there, absolutely a lot of abuses. And you mentioned retaliation, which is completely illegal. If someone were to call into the city and complain because X, Y, or Z, and the landlord retaliated in some form or fashion, that is against the law, and there are serious ramifications for that. I think we need to have an education